Target number, Sierra Tango 356, over. Shot, over. Splash, out. Intended impact grid. Charlie, Oscar, 25768122554. Danger close. Corrected Fire-4-Effect, out.
Welcome back to Fire-4-Effect. We started offering a drop-in trigger assembly. With that drop-in trigger, you're going to need to do some installation, so we thought it's time for us to put together an installation video. To do this drop-in installation, you are going to need to be able to do a detailed teardown and reassembly of your Glock firearm. So this can serve both purposes, not just trigger assembly installation, but a complete detailed teardown and reassembly. So to do this, we're going to start off with a stock Glock 19. As with any firearm that we're going to work with, we're going to make sure we got a couple things checked first. First, no magazine in the weapon. Second, we're going to inspect the chamber and make sure we don't have anything in the firearm. The firearm is loaded. Okay. Second thing we're going to do is check it again, make sure that the weapon is clear. So to do this installation, you're going to need a couple of tools. First tool I recommend is a Glock assembly or Glock armorer's tool. This is a very simple little tool. If you've got a small screwdriver, something like that, it can probably suffice. But there are a couple little things about this design that make it handy, so for the $10 or whatever it is online, I'd suggest you get one. Second thing I'm going to be using is a disassembly block, just a block here. If you don't have one, you don't want to purchase one. I've seen some guys do something like just use a roll of tape in place of that. Third thing I'm going to have in my hand is this pointer, and I'm strictly using this scribe device as just a pointer tool. It's not going to be used in the actual assembly or disassembly. When you buy our drop-in trigger, you're going to receive a clamshell plastic case like this. It'll have the drop-in trigger bar with the trigger shoe already attached. It'll have a little Ziploc baggie inside, which will have 2 springs and a connector. This is all the parts you're going to need to get your new trigger running and get a much better trigger on your gun. So let's start the disassembly. To start the disassembly, we have to do our field strip. Field strip, weapon's clear. Now we need to pull the trigger, pull the weapon, grasp it as such, pull back just a little bit. You have 2 slide lock levers. Pull them down together. Release, slide comes apart. I'm going to set the frame to the side. Slide here, we're going to do a complete teardown on this slide. The only thing we're not going to do is we're not going to pull the sights off. Why are we doing this? Because the spring underneath the striker block here, this has got to be replaced. So to do this teardown, first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our tool, we're going to insert between the striker and the plastic housing. So to get this apart, what we're going to do is we're going to stand the gun on its nose. I'm going to insert this in here, push down, and then I'm going to slide the back plate forward. It'll just come right out. What keeps that back plate in place is the tension between your striker sleeve, which is spring-loaded, and this circle right here. A lot of folks see the little indent right here and think that's a place to put a screwdriver and pry. No, not what that's for. So push down, this will slide right out. Once that slides out, your striker assembly can come out. We don't need to take this apart any further. If you needed to, you can insert it backwards to where the striker comes down on the frame. You can then use that to hold it while you pull down on the springs and remove your spring cups if you want to change out your striker spring. We're going to set that aside. Second thing is the extractor rod. I'm going to take this rod out. It does have 3 pieces, small black plastic piece wedged into this spring, which is then wedged onto the extractor rod. We don't need to disassemble that. Going to set it aside. Going to pull the recoil spring out. It is a captured spring. It's on a rod. It shouldn't come apart. We'll set that aside. And your barrel, of course, can come out. Set that aside. Now, to get this striker block assembly out of here, it's basically a spring-loaded trapped mechanism. I'm going to use my tool here. I'm simply going to push in on it, and the extractor should fall out the side. You may need to tap on it if it's got a lot of carbon or muck on it. It may hang up. It should just fall right out. Once it falls out, I'm going to set it aside here in an orderly fashion. The spring will then push this out farther. What I do is just tap it, and it should fall out the bottom. You may have to get in there and actually hook it with something and pull it up if it's got a lot of grime and grease on it. Now, the back of this has a spring. The stock spring is a silver or aluminum color. We want to take that spring, it should be lightly wedged in here, take it out. We're then going to take our new Glock trigger, We're going to open our little Ziploc baggie here, and we're going to remove the two new springs and the new connector. These springs are a different color. They have kind of a copper brown color to them. I'm going to take this spring, I'm going to insert it in the striker block, and we're going to reverse the process. I'm now going to insert this back into the striker block channel, and I'm going to compress it with my finger. With it compressed, I'm going to take my extractor. Your extractor has a large round area. If you look in the slot here, it can go in one way. It should go in all the way, hold it in, release the striker block. That now has spring tension holding it all together. It won't come apart. Okay? At this point, we can go ahead and reinsert our extractor rod, our striker assembly, put those back in, stand it back on its nose, take the plate, insert it into the slot, and I hold it with tension like this. Using my tool, I push down on the striker assembly. It goes in that far. Now I push down on the extractor rod. It goes in the rest of the way, and you hear a nice little snap. To make sure you have this assembled correctly, push in on the striker bar. You should hear it clanking around. This one's a little bit sticky. It's got a lot of grime on it. We didn't clean it up. Once that's all back together, we can take the barrel, insert it back, take the recoil spring assembly, push it in, and your slide's back together. You now have the stock spring out. We'll set that one aside. Now the frame. Frame assembly, we're going to set it with the left side of the gun up, slide release facing up towards us. You have 3 pins. You may have an older Glock. If you have an older Glock that only has 2 pins, just ignore this first pin part and move on. 3 pins. We're going to remove the top pin first. We want to push it from left down to right. I'm going to center it on my block. I'm going to use my Glock tool, my armor's tool, and I'm just going to push it out. This pin, if you notice, it looks kind of like a barbell. The 2 ends are fatter than the center piece. All 3 pins are different. You can't mix them up. Set that aside. Next, this is the trickiest part of the disassembly and reassembly. The slide release is under spring tension, and it rides in a channel on this second pin that we're going to push out. So, I'm going to set it in place. I'm going to put gentle tension on it, and I'm going to wiggle this in and out, forward and backward, until we get the pin to line up just right and push out. And of course, when you're doing this on camera, it doesn't work and you feel like a dummy. But hopefully everybody watching is relishing that it doesn't just fly out of there and make them look silly. So finally I got it pushed out. Here's our pin. Now what you notice is that this pin has 2 grooves in it. The reason this is tricky is now that that's out, this just comes right out. When it's assembled, it will be on the pin and it will be in that groove. And you can see because it's in that groove, if you don't have it lined up just right, it will interfere with the pin pushing out. You got to get it in the middle and then it'll push out. Set these 2 aside. At this point we're going to push out the 3rd pin. Again, using our armor's tool, should just push right out. It's a plastic pin, the other 2 are metal. So this plastic pin, we don't want to mix it up. It is shorter, smaller diameter, no shoulders or notches in it. So again, they're all 3 different. At this point, I'm going to take my armor's tool. I'm going to insert it just behind the locking block, and it just lifts up and pushes out. I'm going to set that aside. And at that point, the trigger assembly can be grasped here and comes out as one piece. The only thing left to take out of this is the mag release and the locking mechanism here. I'm not going to go over that. If you really want to know how to do it, it's very easy to do. You can look at it and figure it out, I'm sure. So, at this point we're ready to disassemble the actual trigger mechanism. The trigger mechanism, as you look here, is spring-loaded. It's got a little tension on it. And if you look down in here, this spring here is the only thing that's keeping that tension on there. What we're going to do is we're going to grasp the trigger as such. We're going to gently twist it and pull up. And as it disassembles, you'll see that the spring is configured in such a manner that looking at it from this direction, down on the connector here, it forms an S shape. So you see the top of the S here, it comes down, and then it hooks back through the trigger housing as such. We're going to bring this up. I'm just going to wiggle that off of there. The trigger bar here, the stock one, is something we're going to put aside. We're not going to use it anymore. The stock trigger spring, we're also going to pull out of the housing, and we're going to set it aside. We're not going to use it again. It's kind of a silver aluminum color, as opposed to the replacement spring we've sent you in your kit, which has this kind of bronzy brownish color. The only other thing to do to this is we need to remove the connector. Now earlier I said this was the only tool you needed to do this job. I lied. You do need this small screwdriver. It's ideal to reach in here and get this connector out, and what I do is I sneak it in behind here and just twist. Now when it's in place properly, you'll notice that this is actually spring steel. It's bent out a little bit. It's supposed to. That's not broken. Don't fix it. Pull that out, set it aside. That connector is a stock connector. As you can see, it has no markings on the back. If you pull one and it has no markings or just a dot, that is a stock connector. It's supposed to be 5.5 pound trigger pull per Glock. That's what we're going to set aside. The only thing left of this trigger housing is the ejector. The ejector here, if you had to change this housing out with a different Glock, the ejector has a slight bend to it, and that is specific to the caliber of the weapon. If you needed to change it out, you would simply grasp it with a pair of pliers and pull it out like such. If you wanted to put it back in, you just, again, insert and press it in. Make sure it goes in all the way. This is not a necessary component of the trigger install we're doing. We just added this for completeness. So your trigger housing, we're now ready to install the actual new drop-in trigger. We're going to start with your new connector. Your new connector is a Ghost Ink connector. It has a little minus sign barely scribed back here that tells you it's a 3.5 pound connector. It's supposed to be a 3.5 pound connector. We're going to insert it back in the slot, push it all the way in. Again, it should stick out a little bit. That spring steel is supposed to be like that. Don't bend it in. Once we have that, now we're going to take our new trigger bar. Your new trigger bar has the new aluminum trigger shoe, flat face. This has the black safety. It's been attached to a new trigger bar, which has been polished and reshaped, and the sear recut. We then take our new spring, our new trigger spring. What I do is I insert it from the back so that when I look down on it, as it's going to go into the housing here, it's again forming that S shape. When you put this in, you'll notice that your trigger bar has a notch here in the bottom. Ideally, you want the spring to be in that notch. I've had one occasion where the spring got twisted sideways on the assembly, and this end of the spring was hooking on the inside of the housing and interfering with smooth trigger action. So make sure it is actually hooked down there in that notch on the bottom. Then I'm going to take the housing and we're going to hook it in there just like that, so that when the spring is assembled as such, it's forming that S shape. The top of my S up here, coming down to the bottom of the S in the trigger housing. I'm then going to take the assembly, we're going to twist slightly and push it in. It's nice to look down in there and make sure that spring didn't get twisted or anything like that. When it's all said and done, it should still have that spring tension it had earlier, and you'll notice that it rides on the outside of the connector here. Your gun is now ready to reassemble. We're going to take the trigger mechanism. We're going to insert it back into the trigger housing pocket back here. The trigger goes down in the slot, and that's all there is to that. Now we're going to insert the locking block. The locking block is going to insert, push all the way down. That's all there is to that. Now, pin number 1 is, we're going to put them back in the same order we took them out. Pin number 1 is the little barbell shaped one. It goes in the top hole. We're going to push this one in first. Use your armorer's tool, push it all the way in, and then take the corner of the armorer's tool, which has a specific radius that you'll notice when I pushed it in flat, it's flush here, but it's sunk here. If I take the corner of the tool and push in, it pushes it in just the right amount that it's even on both sides. That's the nice thing about this tool. Now we're going to take our slide stop, or slide release, your slide lock, whatever you want to call it. We're going to insert this. There is a slot next to your trigger on the left. That's where this piece is going to insert. And what you'll notice as you insert it is that this spring is going to be trapped by the pin that you just inserted. If you insert this prior to the top pin, when you insert the pin, it will come in, it will hit the spring, and it will either get stopped and stuck, or you will shear the spring and damage this piece irreparably. So make sure the top pin's all the way in. Now insert this next to your trigger. Make sure that it goes all the way in such that it's lined up with the saddle here, if you will. Once that's in, take your trigger pin. It's the pin that has the 2 notches in it. We're going to insert that from the right, pushing left. And what you'll notice is that it usually goes to about this point and it locks up and it doesn't want to go any further. Little trick of the trade, take your armorer's tool, insert it in the same hole, pull back gently, pin goes all the way in. Take the corner, push it, now it's even on both sides. Alright, so the front's assembled. Now your last pin goes in the back here. You should be able to get it started with your fingers. Take your tool, push it in, use your corner, even it up. Your frame's back assembled. Take your slide. You're going to place 3 drops of lubricant. 1 on each rail and 1 on the centerpiece here. That's all the lubricant you need. Do not put any lubricant down in your striker channel. The striker channel is a dry system. It's designed with this hole here so that if anything got up in there, it could drain out. But if this hole fills with crud, grime, shooting debris, and you have oil in there, you can get a hydraulic lock which won't allow the striker to fly forward. You'll get an actual dead trigger and a failed weapon. This striker should not have any oil on the inside. It's a dry system. Take your gun once it's lubricated, reassembled, place it on the rails, guide it back, rack the slide, and it locks it in place. Now you can test your trigger. No take up, immediately brakes crisp and clean, very, very little over travel. Rack it, check the reset. Solid, positive, clear reset. Grasp the trigger from the sides, not engaging the trigger safety. The trigger will not work. Your safety mechanism is functioning properly. Finally, push down on the slide, gun fires. Rack it, pull up on the slide, gun fires. You're testing your engagement of the sear on the striker there. If your striker was worn excessively or broken, or if the trigger bar we sent you had a defect in the shape of the trigger bar back here, you might have a failure there. If you do have a failure to fire on either one of those, we need to talk. And that's all there is to the Glock reassembly. This reassembly will work on Glock compact, standard, long slide, large frame slides. The only one that is a little bit different is the Glock 42. The Glock 42 is a 2-pin design. You still check the weapon, it's clear. Pull the trigger. Pull your slide off, the same mechanism. The only difference here is this pin, when you push it out, you've got to get it off of here, and it's under a different spring tension, so you end up arguing with this one quite a bit. It's a little bit more frustrating to get this pin out, but it is the same technique. You just have to push that pin out, then you push out the rear pin, and the whole assembly comes out. The spring design here is slightly different, but if you pull it out and pull it apart like we just showed you, you'll see how that mechanism works as well. And that's all there is to disassembly, reassembly of the Glock's handgun series and installation of a Fire-4-Effect drop-in trigger. Thank you for your time. Fire-4-Effect, we're out.